Well, welcome to another Black History Conversations. We're going to have a really interesting presentation this time, and we've got a great bunch of people here with us. So, welcome to you all. As you know, when we start Black History Conversations, so she trying to find the right place on my screen. I start with an acknowledgement of country. So. You can see on the screen, I'm just going to get sorted and get the different things managed. Okay, so, well, before I even start with the acknowledgement of country, we're welcoming Nigel Sadler. So that's really great. Thank you very much indeed. We've been waiting for a few weeks for you to join us, so we're very much looking forward to it. And I recognise that you've also got lots of experience as a museum curator and long-time explorer of Black and White history with many stories, and one-time director of the Turks and Caicos National Museum. Sounds very fascinating. And we're going to be hearing today especially about the story about the Trouvadore Project, the legacy of a sunken slave ship. So thanks very much for joining us today, Nigel. And Nigel's consultancy is called Sands of Time. So I'm just going to now do the acknowledgement of country. I'm actually in Australia at the moment, so you must forgive me if I'm forgetting what I'm talking about. It's the small hours of the morning and I'm a bit tired. The acknowledgement of country is done at all meetings for a lot of the television programs, an acknowledgement of the country, as it's called here. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of this country and acknowledge and respect their continued connection to the land, sea, and community. We pay respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and we extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. You may have heard in the news that we had a referendum here to give the first Australian people, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, a voice to Parliament. And the outcome of the referendum was absolutely devastating. The outcome was no, a very clear no. No, the no vote also included the people who didn't know what to vote. So it's just so distressing. So after a week of silence, Aboriginal leaders have started to talk again. And I noticed this week on the TV programme that they were beginning to discuss it. It was such a huge shock to them. So it's really sad. We also decided that we would have a Black History Conversations acknowledgement. Jackie Pennant, one of our folks who joins us from time to time, made this suggestion. So the Black History Conversations sessions acknowledge, or teams, acknowledge the injustice of the actions taken by the British and other European countries that invaded and took possession of the islands of the Caribbean Sea, as well as the continents of North and South America. In addition, we also recognise the exploitation of the great continents of Africa, Asia, Australia, and many other parts of the world in the centuries of colonisation and ongoing exploitation. We acknowledge that this has resulted in the destruction and destabilisation of so many nations, peoples, and cultures. And I found a 1665 map of the world where Australia isn't even on it. To illustrate that. Now I'm just going to stop sharing because I just want to consult us. We've got some really eminent folks with us today. I'm delighted to hear your reaction about that second acknowledgement, which we're trying to refine. And I don't know if you're listening in at the moment, Simon, or not, but I know there was a slight modification that I was supposed to have made to that, and I haven't done it yet. But has anybody else got any comments on that? No, well, if you're happy enough with it, or unhappy with it, I'd like to hear, but no comments at the moment. Right, okay, off we go with the screen sharing. Now, the next slide I haven't completed doing because I've been doing other things like writing bids. And this is that we decided, Simon and I decided after one of our recent sessions that we would have some housekeeping information that we'd share each session. So how did you get on with the signing straight in, first of all? Was that all right? Well, you're all here, so good. Thank you, Garrick. Excellent. Joan Grant's coming back in again. All right. Good. Rebecca's got her thumb up. Excellent. Thank you, Rebecca. Okay, then. So next, please send your name and email link if I've not already got it. So thanks, Rebecca, for that. Now, the next sentence I've started, not completed, because we want to say that the subject matter that we discuss can often be quite confrontational. And what we want to say is that it's fine, and looking at my screen now, most of you are doing it, it's fine to switch your camera off. That's fine. You don't have to be sitting still all the time. I tend to keep my camera on so that I can, it's a discussion between us. Simon has his very nice photograph on. Unfortunately, the timing now means that Simon can't always stay throughout the sessions, but he's hosted these sessions on the Belong Nottingham platform for 122 times now. This is just getting amazing. And Garrick's going to come in with a comment. Thanks, Garrick.
Yes, just to continue the last point you made, Liz, on the housekeeping. Some of these conversation that is presented to us quite emotive, and sometimes it could be another way of traumatizing individual. So what we're suggesting that each of our presentations will come with a health warning to alert individual that if they need to keep their camera off because of any emotion that may come out of the material, they can do so. If they need to step away from the information and come back, they can also do so. And if they need a separate conversation after the session, I'm available to have that conversation.
All right. Well, thank you very much indeed, Garrick, for saying that, because we don't want to re-traumatize anyone, and we just want to make it reasonable. Anyway, after that long introduction, what I'm going to suggest now is that I've already introduced you, Nigel, and we're so pleased that you're with us. I have a copy of your book here just to prove, how important I thought your book was. It was part of my luggage that I brought back over here. I bought it at the International Slavery Museum. Okay, I'm reading your point as well, Yanita. That's fine. That's great. Nigel, it's really an honour and a pleasure that you're able to join us. And we're really keen to hear about the slave ship. And perhaps afterwards, if there's time, we might have some conversations about museums as well, because that's obviously an area that you've got a great deal of expertise in. So over to you. You okay?
I'm hoping that's you can see my screen.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Funny enough, I've had a problem with my Zoom over the last few weeks. And yesterday I did a massive clear up on my computer. And in the process, I found some notes I took at a conference in January, which is very apt to start this off. And I'll just read that out. The notes I found, it comes from a conference I was at for the Slave Wreck Project, which is a group of archaeologists who are looking and studying wrecks and archaeological sites related to enslavement. And what they said on the introduction notes on the conference was, slave ship archaeology is not about the past. a long forgotten event. It's about its relevance to today's present society, the legacy of those who made the journey on the ship or made similar journeys on other ships. If we look at just the ship, it continues the colonial dialogue as a vessel of commerce rather than a ship of barbaric criminality. So today I'm going to talk about a particular slave ship called the Troubadour and the search, discovery, and legacy of the slave ship. This story takes place in the Caribbean. Here's a map of 1831, but it takes place in a country that most people have never even heard of, the Turks and Caicos Islands. And it's this little chain of islands to the southern tip of the Bahamas archipelago, which is made up of two banks of islands, the Caicos Bank and the Turks Bank. And this is where the story of the Troubadour is based. The country itself, though, has two different histories. The Turks Islands are the political capital and started off by raking salt. The Bermudians came down seasonally, set up salt ponds, left the enslaved workers there, went off, did some wrecking, did some turtle hunting, came back, picked up the enslaved workers and the salt, and went back to Bermuda via the eastern seaboard to sell the salt. Eventually, the British declared ownership fully of the islands, and a permanent settlement was taken on the island, and it set up a permanent salt production plant there, with the main industry being just salt. The Caicos Islands, though, the bigger bank of islands, only started to be occupied following the War of Independence in America, when the Loyalists fled America and were granted land in various other locations, initially in Florida until Florida was seized, and they then moved into the Bahamas archipelago, including the Turks and Caicos Islands and the Caicos Bank, where they set up cotton plantations. On the left hand is the remains of Hallover Plantation on Middle Caicos. Initially, the cotton harvests were very good, but unfortunately, the soil is very poor. Channel bugs infested the cotton harvest, and then two hurricanes saw the end of it. So by 1820s, there was no cotton production in the country. The story of the research project begins just after the founding of the Turks and Caicos National Museum in 1991. This is the photograph of the museum. It's actually on the seafront, and it's in one of the oldest buildings on Grand Turk. This is the state of the Grand Turk Archive when I arrived on the island in 2000, in January 2000. I have to say now, it doesn't look like this anymore. It's gone. Basically, it's been neglected and destroyed and thrown away. And so on the island, there's actually very little original archive material. What we do know, though, is that in this material, there was actually very little pre-1866, which is a major hurricane. So it would not have covered the period of study that were taken for this Troubadour shipwreck. What this means is that the researchers for the museum in the 1990s had to go overseas to find archives. And one of those archives they found was a George Judson Gibbs letter book. The museum founder, Greta Sane, was very big, had a major interest in the Amerindians, the native Lucayans of the island. And so she was looking for Lucayan artifacts that were actually in the Smithsonian and American museums. And she came across this research book. And it's a series of letters, quite a few of them, are written by George Judson Gibbs on Grand Turk to Joseph Henry, the director of the Smithsonian, and John Evans, the honorary director of the Geological Society of London, trying to see if they'd be interested in buying some of his artifacts. Now, George Judson Gibbs, he was the son of the Collector of Customs. That was George Gibbs as well, 1804 to 1865. And as Collector of Customs, or sub-collector as he was in 1840, his dad had access to a lot of items that were being imported and exported or seized by the customs officers. And some of those in the book are listed as two African idols. Now, there are various references to these, so I'm just going to read out one of them. And what it says is two African idols found on board the last Spanish slaver of wood with glass eyes, schooner Esperanza, wrecked in the year 1841 at Breezy Point on the Caicos Islands. The slaves from this vessel were taken possession of by the government and brought to Grand Turk Island. The captain of the slaver escaped the penalty by being a Spaniard or being hung according to British laws. The slaves were apprenticed for the space of 1 year, and they and their descendants form at the present time, viz. the year 1878, the pith of our present labouring population. That raised a lot of questions because there's a few references to books in some of the other publications, but very little has been written about this. And here are the African idols. But are they African idols? They are, in fact, carver figures from Easter Island. Okay. So, as a sideline, we don't know why they're on an African ship trading from Africa to the Caribbean. And in fact, they are listed as two of the best examples in the Western world in a museum collection. And they were, I think they still are, on display in the Natural History Museum in New York, because George Jefferson Gibbs' wife actually did sell them when he died in 1899. Now, at this time, Greta Salem, as I said, had an interest in the Lucayans, not in other aspects of the history of the islands, but they did pay for one day's research work in London for someone to go in, and they looked at 1841 for the shipwreck. And in fact, the ship that wrecked in 1841 is not the Esperanza. So Esperanza is another slave ship, and I'll quickly go through it here because it's quite significant in the other story of Troubadour as well, in that this wrecked in 1837. It wrecked north of the Caicos Islands, which was off Middle Caicos. It was sailing under Portuguese colours, bringing enslaved Africans to the Cuban markets. And it left Africa with a cargo of around 320 enslaved Africans. Around 100 of these died on the crossing. 220 Africans came ashore, but many died. 192 were rescued and taken to Grand Turk. And after being processed there, they were all shipped to Nassau. 4 died on this journey, leaving 129 males and 59 males alive in Nassau. It's interesting for this reason. 1838, we had an apprenticeship scheme going up until 1838. We didn't need new, cheap labour. And therefore, these people were shipped immediately to be the problem of the Bahamas, who were overseeing the Turks and Caicos Islands at the time. What we found out, or later on, was that the vessel that sank in 1841 is called Troubadour, which is a Spanish word meaning wandering minstrel. But in the original documents, we see it spelt in many different ways. And that's the reason why there's a discrepancy between the project that took place in the early 2000s and what I'm doing now, because I'm using a slightly different name. Troubadour is in the original papers from the government of Cuba. They spell the name without the U. We have to ask why a Spanish official is spelling it wrongly in the Spanish papers. In American newspapers that cover the story of the wrecking, they used AUR at the end. In the official English records, it's known as Troubadour, but this seems to be a phonetic spelling of it rather than a proper thing. And in the slave registry you were talking about earlier, Liz, it's listed as Troubadour. It's now been changed. And that's because in the registering of the ship, they'd misread it in the record books. I'll be honest, the handwriting is quite difficult to read. Now, in the 1990s, there wasn't very much interest in uncovering more of the story. So coincidentally, when I arrived in the islands to take over as director of the Turks and Caicos National Museum, it coincided with the UNESCO Slave Routes Project in partnership with the World Trade Organization. For those who don't know about this project, it was started in the early to mid 1990s, and the idea was for every country involved in the transatlantic slave trade, so in Africa, in Europe, and the Americas, each country was to identify up to 25 sites in their country that signified enslavement, emancipation, place of memory, significant locations. And on my first week in the museum work out in the Turks and Caicos Islands, the Museum Association of the Caribbean contacted me, who are leading on it in the Caribbean, said, can I do this to submission for Turks and Caicos Islands? I was horrified when I went around the museum in that there was only one mention in the whole museum to enslavement. And when I asked the manager, I said, why isn't there any more? He goes, the locals don't want to know about it. It's a negative story, and tourists don't want to be depressed. And I said, that's not right. And so I looked at the books we had in our library, which wasn't very much. And I did some research work in archives around, especially in England. And from that, we identified, I think, 15 sites we could actually look at as being on the list. But the research work went into a publication called Slave History in the Turks and Caicos Islands, which actually highlighted some key elements of the story of development of the country and how the enslaved population actually built the country, how the salt industry was built upon the backs of them, how the cotton industry was built on the backs of them. But we also produced this little guide here called Finding Our Roots, which opens up into a big poster, and that was supplied to every secondary school child in the Turks and Caicos Islands. But whilst doing this, it was very clear that one of the big stories was the Troubadour slave ship. And I'll explain why now. The 1830s was a major period of change. In 1833, we had the Emancipation Act passed in London. In 1834, it became law in most Caribbean islands, not all of them. For example, it became law in the Cayman Islands in 1835, and that's because all but the Cayman Islands agreed to take on an apprenticeship period. from 1834 to 1840, the Cayman Islands refused and went straight into emancipation in 1835 for everybody. It was very clear the emancipation period, the apprenticeship period, which was supposed to teach the former slave workers how to be free, was really just a way of providing the plantation owners with a cheap source of labor for 6 years. And so it was brought to an end after only 4 years in 1838. At this time, even though Britain had outlawed slavery and the slave trade in 1807, lots of countries in the Caribbean were still carrying on the slave trade, mostly illegally. And the biggest one was Cuba. And this was Havana, depicted in 1844, at roughly the time of the Troubadour story. And the British had a Navy vessel based in the harbour at Havana, and that was called HMS Romney. And they were to deal with any liberated Africans that got there and were freed, either by Royal Navy ships or by other vessels. They were put on HMS Romney and taken away from slavery in the Caribbean, in Cuba. The ship had a detachment of soldiers in the West Indies Regiment, but to be honest, they had very limited powers and relied on the goodwill of the Cuban authorities. I'm sorry this text is very small, but it's an important element. In 1839, Lieutenant Fitzgerald was in command of this attachment to the 2nd West Indies Regiments, and he wrote to the Admiralty recommending that an armed tender was also supplied to support the Romney so that they could actually help protect the liberated Africans. And Mr. Turnbull, the consul, the British consul in Havana, also agreed with this, but it was decided not necessary. And in 1838, though, it was also recorded that Lord Hill had directed the officers in command of troops at the Bahamas to select for the guard on board Romney men from different parts of Africa in order they might act as interpreters to newly introduced Africans. I've got Lieutenant Fitzgerald's signature down there. Please remember his names. I'll be bringing him up again shortly. The problem is HMS Romney was in Havana. Havana was being watched by the authorities. So the slave trade just moved to the eastern island, to the east end of the island, to Santiago. And that's where most of the slave ships left and returned to. And that is where Troubadour left from. We know it was a brigantine and it weighed around 111 tons. We know it was sailing under Spanish papers, and the crew was Spanish, but during the crossing, some died and were replaced with Portuguese sailors in Africa. You may ask why were they replaced with Portuguese, not Spanish? That's because the big ports, actually this time shipping out the Africans into slavery, were run by Portuguese, the Portuguese colonies. One of our problems is Troubadour was lost by accident. It wasn't lost by a rebellion. So because there's no rebellion, we have no named African hero who led the rebellion. We have no court case. So the information about the Troubadour is very scant. So for example, we have no details of the journey across the Atlantic, what took place in it, how many people died. We have no idea what the port of embarkation was, numbers of Africans lost on the crossing, the cargo taken. We have none of this information. It was lost in an accident. So what cargo could it have been carrying? Again, in my research work has shown that the 1830s and early 1840s, at the time of Troubadour, and Mr. Waldrop was exporting Scottish cloth from Glasgow on his ships to Mr. Valoldo in Cuba. And this was purchased exclusively by traders to the coast of Africa. Mr. Turnbull, just mentioned, who was actually the consul in Havana, raised concerns and wanted these people in Scotland arrested because they were trading illegally in goods going to Africa to buy enslaved workers. We know in 1841, Drew McSimmon and Hutton used Mr. Waldrop's ships to export plain and coloured cotton cloth, cotton handkerchiefs, cotton bricks, cotton thread, silk, silk hosiery, paint, copper, bar and pig iron, cast iron pipes, cast iron pots and pans, tin plates, earthenware, coal, preserved provisions, dried fish and potatoes. It is clear that some of these products, if not a large number of these products, were going straight back onto the ships into Africa to buy the enslaved workers. And therefore, we can easily say that some of the cargo on Troubadour would have been Scottish cloth. So where were the Africans loaded on Troubadour? Well, the British records have it being sailing from Sao Tome. However, one contemporary American newspaper suggested the ship belonged to Rosalind Kitan and had sailed from Bissau. To put it into context, they're the two locations. They're a long way apart from each other. The only connection is they were both governed by the Portuguese, and coincidentally, both of them would have been taking enslaved Africans from roughly the same area. And I'm going to show here You see Bambara there. Would have definitely been taking people from the Bambara region in Africa. How many Africans were loaded onto Trouvadore? So in the British records, there are no numbers. But if we assume that the usual death rate was between a quarter and a third, the loaded number would have been between 256 and 288 humans. The Boston Courier, another report in an American newspaper, actually recorded the number of Africans loaded as 289. We don't know where they got that figure from, but as you can see, it fits in with the estimates I'd come up with between 256 and 288. So it's a good estimate. Now the wrecking. We know the ship wrecked at Breezy Point in East Caicos, and here we are. This is Breezy Point. Very eastern spot. Up until a few years ago, I think it's still the case, this is the largest deserted island in the Caribbean. It's massive. There was a small period of occupation in the early 1800s while they raised cattle on the island. They left a few enslaved workers as raised cattle. And there was a very large sizable plantation there in the 1890s onwards. But at the time of the wrecking in 1841, the island was deserted. You can probably just make out in the distance over here, another island, that's Middle Caicos. That's where the initial rescuers come from. Spoiler alert, we found the wreck. So you can see this is the point of land here. That's Black Rock, and the wreck is just here. So it's actually very close to Breezy Point. The reason we did the flyover with a helicopter, which we gained because we supported another company with a project they were doing, they provided us with a helicopter for a day, was to identify where the most likely places are for a wooden shipwreck was. We wouldn't see the wreck from the air, but we would see metal wrecks. We would see where the reef line is. We could see scarring in the reef possibly. More importantly, though, we were looking for logistics. Where would we live? Where would we put our liveaboard dive boat whilst we're doing the work? The water here is 15, 20 feet deep. Here is about 40 feet deep. And a bit further out, it drops down to about 3,000 feet straight down. So you can see if the shipwreck went into 3,000 foot of water, we're not going to find it. Even at 50, 60 feet, we'd have difficulty. So we were actually, from all the paperwork, assuming it actually rode over the reef, so it would be in this area here. But we couldn't bring the liveaboard dive boat over the reef because it would just scratch the bottom to pieces. The question we have to ask ourselves is, why did the ship wreck? Because this is a calm night. You can see the reef line. You can see the island. It's very visible. We believe the ship would have been sailing past the island in the darkness to avoid any observations by the British, who would have actually tried bringing the ship in and capturing the Africans off it to free them. So what we assume is there's no bad weather, because there's no report of bad weather in any of the reports. And when the rescue teams came from Grand Turk, the only way they would have come across is it had been clear weather, because it's very difficult to cross over that passageway. So we don't think it's bad weather. So it must have been either a navigational error, the person on the helm fell asleep, or maybe the rudder broke and it just drifted over the reef. Now, this is the most important part of it. No one died in the wrecking. All 193 Africans on board the ship when it wrecked were alive. One was shot dead trying to escape by the Spanish crew. 177 were picked up immediately by the Middle Caicos Islanders who came across to help. And the 15 that ran off into the bush were recovered and brought back and handed over. The important fact here is they all survived the wrecking. That alone means the ship did not break up, it did not go into deep water, and therefore that would suggest there's something left of the wreck to find. As I said about these two banks of islands, this is on the Caicos Bank. A message was sent across the British government offices in Grand Turk to say, could they send some help? And Lieutenant Fitzgerald was requested to proceed forthwith a sufficient number of men to Breezy Point for the purposes of securing the captain and crew of the said slaver, and for making such provision for carrying them to Nassau, otherwise as may deem necessary. That is the Lieutenant Fitzgerald from the HMS Romney, who was actually in Cuba. I hate to say it, I think he was actually assigned to Grand Turk as punishment for keeping interfering with trying to improve the welfare of the black people and the enslaved populations. So I think his position on Grand Turk, because it wasn't a nice posting, was possibly one of punishment. Now, I've got a list of names here. Don't bother looking at them. We know Lieutenant Fitzgerald took a detachment of 17 men. We know at this time there are 29 members of the 2nd West India Regiment soldiers on Grand Turk with Lieutenant Fitzgerald, and these are the names of those men on Grand Turk. Why have I included the names? Lieutenant Fitzgerald was European, he was white, is British. The corporals George Goswell and William Ware possibly were also going to be white. All of the privates are black. Nearly all, probably all of the privates, are liberated Africans, and most likely first-generation Africans in the Caribbean. When we're going through this record, because we have no sinking in the ship, we have no hero, and we have no black voice. We have no names linked to the Africans on board the ship. This is the only time I can find any names of black people involved in this incident. That alone just shows you the bias of British history. If the names are not in the record books, they don't exist. We have numbers, we don't have names. But what we can say is every one of these men on this list interacted at some point with the liberated Africans, either going to their rescue or working with them on Grand Turk. As I said before, the 1838 reference, a lot of them would have been speaking original African language as their first language. And English is their second language, and they'd have been acting as translators. Again, we don't get those reports. We don't get the translation reports written down. We get the official figures and representations from the official bodies. There was no safe place on Grand Turk for them to go, so they were all put inside the prison walls only because it was a secure area for them. It wasn't because they'd been naughty, they'd come in and committed a crime. They put them inside the prison walls because that was the safest place for them. What we know is 192 Africans, 20 men and 4 women were sent on to Nassau with Troubadour crew, and 168 remained in the Turks and Caicos Islands. We ask ourselves why these people were sent to Nassau, 20 men and 4 women. Were they because they were the ones with the illnesses? But look at that discrepancy, 20 men and 4 women. It is, I would guess, that Lieutenant Fitzgerald chose some of the fittest men to take with him because they would be ideal for the West India Regiment. On Grand Turk, the survivors had to go through an apprenticeship. And the distributed Africans were as follows: 89 men, 39 boys, 26 women, 11 girls, 3 infants. Each was given 3 suits of Osnaburg clothing, and then 8 quarts of corn and 1 pint of molasses per week, and fish or meat occasionally. They received accommodation and medical care. The children could only operate as indentured domestic servants, and all had to be taught English and Christianity. To be taught had to be free in the Caribbean, basically. Now, I've given you all these figures, and you're going to ask me, why is this such a significant wreck? Well, sorry, going to apprenticeship. The apprenticeship they did on Grand Turk would have been the salt industry. It changed very little from the first days, even to up to the 1970s. It's seasonal, and therefore you would actually create a large debt with the salt pond owners. In the periods you were not actually allowed to work because there was no work. It was a hard job. Workers went blind. They got cataracts because of the sun rebounding off the water. They got sores on the legs for standing in highly salinated water. But this was the job that was available to them. If you want to read an account of salt raking on Grand Turk, Mary Prince's account of her time as an enslaved woman, which was written in 1831, she spent 10 years on Grand Turk working in the salt industry. And again, that wasn't recognized in the Turks and Caicos Islands. This very famous writer, probably the most important piece of literature by an enslaved woman in the period of enslavement in the Caribbean, she spent 10 years on Grand Turk. Now, why is this shipwreck important? It's one ship. The Turks and Caicos Islands are a very small country. Here is a population in 1843. It has 2,495 people. If you put 168 people onto that island, that increased the population by 7%. And that increase was 7% of either people in childbearing ages or about to enter childbearing ages. So they would have added to the population very quickly. That comment earlier made the pith of our working population is quite significant. They have quickly ended up being quite a large part of that working population. What we also know is that between 1834 and 1840, another 189 liberated Africans had been taken to the Turks and Caicos Islands from Bahamas, of which by 1840, 151 remained, 72 were on Grand Turk, 43 on Salt Key, and 36 in the Caicos Islands. Between 1841 and 1850, another 186 were settled, but this is just the Troubadour survivors. If we take all first-generation liberated Africans, they made up 15% of the population in 1843. So as a Caribbean nation, they've got very strong ties straight back to Africa through first-generation Africans. Now, 1842, when the apprenticeship ended, was quite a big period of change in the Turks and Caicos Islands. The former slave owners on Turks Bank were afraid that emancipation brought economic equality. The salt ponds worked on the headright system. The 1st of January every year, every adult had an equal share of the salt pond. In the days of enslavement, the enslaved workers' shares went to their owner. From 1838, the share went to the enslaved worker, the former enslaved worker. So that couldn't happen any longer. So they actually took it out of leasehold to freehold, and only people with money could buy it. And by 1845, all the salt ponds were freehold and were held by the former enslaved, the slave owners. On Grand Turk, there's also a concern of the ratio of black and white population. So if you have a large group of first-generation African arriving, that changes the social structure. We also know the British government had a policy to keep Africans free from slave ships together and set up settlements for themselves, for them, especially if in Nassau. So if you read some of Gail Saunders' books, they detail some of these settlements. And also the Caicos Islands were greener and more fertile and therefore able to sustain the population. Again, that year, 1842, some records have a settlement called Bambara being set up in 1842. The folklore is that Bambara was set up by Africans from a shipwreck. And Bambara is the only settlement with an African name. As I showed you earlier, we believe a large number of the Africans on board Trouvadore would have been from the Bambara region in Africa. This therefore fits in quite nicely. They were actually tried to set their own settlement, and they were given land around an area in Middle Caicos, which is now set up as Bambara. South Caicos. The Turks Islands were mainly on the Turks Bank. The salt islands were mainly on the Turks Bank. They decided there to expand the salt island production onto South Caicos. So even though the town on South Caicos was developed in 1840, nothing happened there until 1842. They moved some of the salt workers from Grand Turk to South Caicos. It is very easy to assume that they moved a large number of the men who had arrived on Trouvadore across to South Caicos. They'd never known enslavement. They worked quite hard, and they had been taught the trade and had no kind of withdrawal symptoms from the past, which a lot of other people had. So for the archaeological work, we were lent a helicopter in 2003 to fly over the site. In 2004, we had our first field season, and this was just a survey to look around Breezy Point. The museum out there had set up and helped the government set up proper legislation for archaeological work, maritime archaeological work. And it was breached nearly every year by allowing treasure hunters to come in and carry out projects which were financial rip-offs. They were looking for the infamous U-boat full of Nazi gold. They were looking for the Spanish galleon full of gold. And if it was found, everybody would be millionaires on the island. That's what they're looking. It's a scam. They're all scams. We all know they're scams, but the government used to give them licenses. And so our license in 2004 was to really show them how a project should be run and how it should be run for the benefit of the country and the population, not for the people investing the money in the project. So we had to make sure everything we did properly. So in 2004, we produced our reports, we did the survey of area. In 2006, we did the second field season, which allowed us to do test excavations on the site of a wooden wreck that we'd found. And we actually felt that the wooden wreck we found this year probably was Trouvadore, but it wasn't quite long enough to be a ship that could have carried that number of passengers or passengers for enslaved Africans or done a transatlantic crossing. And 2008 was the final season where further excavation work showed the ship to be at least 100 feet long, and that would have been sufficient for 300 people or more. As I said, the ship wrecked, probably not that dramatically. It rode over the reef. Probably would not have been floatable again afterwards. But what we do know is in 1842, and this letter 81 refers to this, in that in conformity to directions contained in your Honourable Board's order number 37, dated the 27th of June last, I have this day remitted a commiserate certificate to the Registrar of the High Court of Maritime Admiralty, the amount of the sale of the slave vessel Trouvadore and material stranded at Turks Islands, Bahamas in 1841, being £71, 3 shillings and 5p. Not very much money. What we do know is Lieutenant Fitzgerald salvaged the sails and the rigging, along with the Africans he took back to another thing. We know other salvage efforts took place both legally and illegally. We believe people from Middle Caicos came and looted the ship. They took timber off it for building material. And we know the rest of it was just abandoned there to decay into the river, into the sea. So what would we find remained of it? Well, it depends how much actually got buried. If it remained above the sand, it would be eaten away by the woodworms, the sea worms. It would be destroyed by storms, so nothing would remain in the ground. So in 2004, we used very high-tech techniques of being dragged behind boats. It's called tow boarding. And you're looking down, and if you see something that looks man-made, you release your tow board, put your hand up, and they come back and they do a GPS waypoint. Then in the evening, you see on this map here, these red dots, they're all waypoints. They're all when we've seen something. And a discussion about what we saw, what had been recorded, and then we may send a team of divers in to look at those sites to record what was there. Believe it or not, doing this technique, we found a wooden wreck. That's because we found the ballast mound, the rocks that we used to weight the ship. The following year, in 2006, we bought a magnetometer to do a similar job. It resurveyed the area we did with tow boarders. The tow boarders missed nothing. That's how we can train a tow boarder very easy. It's just actually having people who know about the seabed, what looks and doesn't look natural. The magnetometer though, gave fields. So when it went over something, it wasn't just saying you could see something, it would tell you how big that field was. So where the wooden wreck was, it would tell you there's a field of nails. There's little signals in this area. There's little points there, which is the metalwork off the ship. And it tells you roughly the spread of where the shipwreck could be to allow us to target more about where we should be excavating. And we'd go down and we'd actually map and draw and photograph everything we found. When we were allowed to clear the soil, the sand, we'd have a generator that would suck the sand up. And I don't know if you can see here, these two metal pins. That's those two metal pins there. And this is the cat head from the Troubadour. So put in the short context, that's the cat head there. That slope is that slope there. So it's upside down. The end of this is badly burned. It shows the ship had at some point had a catastrophic fire at the end of its life as well. Whether that was deliberately set or whether it was an accidental lightning strike, we don't know. What we also know is that this cat head is very heavy, but it's found some distance away from the rest of the wreck. So it's not right on the wreck site. This is what the wreck site looks like. These are the knees. So you can see one here, one here. That's going down to the bottom of the ship. The side of the ship is sitting under the sand here. So at some time, it's shifted over onto its side. And we've got the planks of wood showing that as well for some parts of it, and some metal points as well. So here are the metal pins. We found all sorts of things. There wasn't really something that jumped out saying, here's, it's not like the Mary Rose, you've got half a ship. It's not like that. It's just bits and pieces all over the place, which we pieced together. There are very few artifacts from the Troubadour. Anything that could have been salvaged at the time would have been salvaged. This number 3 was found in the first year, and we actually did bring it up because we risked of losing it, is a watermark line. It would have been on the hull to say how deep the ship was sitting in the water. This is the barrel stave. One of the ways to identify if it's a slave ship or not is the number of barrels on board. If it's got lots of barrels on board, unless it's carrying palm oil, it's carrying excessive water for a crew, it must be using the water for either livestock, for animals, or for human cargo, enslaved Africans. But this is one of the telling pieces of references, this here. We found lots of this. And this is copper sheeting. The Royal Navy started experimenting with copper sheeting in the 1750s, and it started putting on their ships in the warm waters in the 1770s. Commercial vessels started using it around the same time, but by 1786, only 3% had actually had them coppered. This therefore tells us the wooden wreck has to be post, we would say 1800. However, what we also know is that when the British government allowed the Royal Navy to chase down slave ships to capture them and free the Africans on board, the owners of slave ships started coppering their ships because it made them faster. So a lot of ships that carrying enslaved Africans from Africa to the Caribbean would have had copper bottoms. So what's the legacy of this? And this is the most important part of all of this. It isn't about the shipwreck, but about the crew. Sorry, about the passengers on board, the enslaved Africans on board. In 1866, Grand Turk was wiped out by a hurricane. Nearly every building on the island was destroyed, with the exception of buildings like the museum, for somehow the museum survived. And the whole country, the whole island was rebuilt in 1866. This was a time where you not only had the first generation after the Troubadour survivors there, you had their children, so their legacy. And when you go around Grand Turk and you look at the historic buildings, you can easily see that they would have had some impact on building these houses. So even though there's been hurricanes since then and some of the houses have been destroyed, the street layouts, the plots of land, this is the town, the island they would have known. As already mentioned, they would have built the salt ponds on South Caicos and the settlement Bambara on Middle Caicos. One of our jobs, though, is to actually get the public talking. I did a radio interview with this gentleman, David Bowen, and we had about 2 or 3 very irate phone calls, basically telling me that I had no right to uncover this past. It's a past they wanted to forget. It was irrelevant to today's history. Why are we going on about it? And luckily, this gentleman here, David Bowen, responded on my behalf, and he said, because we need to know where we've come from. We need to know that our ancestors were fighters and survivors. And without that, how can we know who we are today? And after that, we've got a lot of support on the island. So we actually went out to the community, especially on Middle Caicos and South Caicos, to try and find out what their family knew, but also tell them about the Troubadour story. Dolphus Arthur is a local fisherman from Middle Caicos. He'd actually known there was a wreck because he kept catching his fishing nets on it for his lobster pots. His lines with lobster pots. This turned out to be the Troubadour, and he recounted in 2004, there was always talk among the old people about a shipwreck. My grandmother lived to be 106. She was always talking about how we came from Africa. We had always been free. Now, I'm sorry I didn't pay more attention. I've been passing around that wreckage for years now, never knowing it had any connection to me. David Byrne, I've been talking about. He said, this is important because it's a very positive slave story. We're here because of this. Instead of being sold into a lifetime of bondage and being worked to death, our ancestors settled here as free people. Now, Bowen's grandmother, Ursula Baker, died in 1999, taking along the Bowen's family history with her to go. And David now regrets not sitting down talking to her. Alton Higgs was a very well-known bush medicine man in Middle Caicos, and he always wondered where his skills for potions and poultices had come down, and he wondered whether this had come from the generations from the ship survivors. But he also felt that young people now had little respect for the crafts and culture of their African predecessors. They were leaving Middle Caicos to go to school or work elsewhere, and he was worried that traditional healing and other things would be lost as no one wanted to learn them. Cassandra Johnson was a basket maker. She was born in 1933, and she made a living weaving fenner grass into shades and baskets. And she recalls talk when she was a girl of ancestors who came from Africa. She never paid much attention. People done die and others gone away, she said, when asked about the Keepers of the Islands folklore. Now, one hope I've got that the project may do, or should have done, is to actually look at the weave. The weaves are identical to some that's done in Africa. And we're wondering whether it's actually to link into Bambara, because the strongest basket makers are from Bambara on Middle Caicos. So we're wondering if that's a tradition that actually survived through the wrecking and through that with the people who came there. The cultural links are much stronger on the Caicos Islands, where we believe some of these Troubadour survivors have gone to. The national music is ripsaw music, using tools and upturned buckets. Originally, we now got guitars and proper drums. Making conch horns to actually signal across islands and to actually sing between boats if you had to. And also the storytelling. And the storytelling in Turks and Caicos Island is Babuki and Barabi, a traditional African storytelling, and it's still pot copies today. And David Byrne, I should have said, was the director of the Department of Culture when we were doing the project. He was trying reinvigorating the stories and trying to show people you didn't have to watch cartoons on TV. We had our own fascinating stories of Babuki and Barabi. And the other one is, until revival in the early 2000s, the big festival around Christmas time is Junkanoo. And this was strongest on the Middle and South Caicos until the 1970s. This is a photograph going past the museum in their first year revival. I think it was 2004, when they were reviving it as a tourist product, basically. So what next? My problem is, I was out there as a director of the museum, and I saw this as a community project. I was joined on the project by a team of archaeologists and documentary makers. The plan was always to build a new museum on Providenciales where the core story was going to be the Troubadour. It is my understanding at the moment, and reading between the lines, that is no longer the case. They want to move the shipwreck from the museum on display in on Grand Turk, which is called the Molasses Reef Wreck, which is the oldest European ship in the Americas. They want to move that to Providenciales. They want to bring up finds from a Navy ship called the HMS Endymion, and actually have those on display in Grand Turk. So yet again, we're telling the story of the Royal Navy and Spanish exploration, not the survivors of the islands. There is a small display on the Trouvadore in the temporary museum for Providenciales, and there's a signpost on Grand Turk at the tourist areas where the cruise ships come in with facts which are wrong. When I left, the plan was for the museum and the team to write a book about it. That has not been done. I'd said I'd give them 5 years, so I should have written the book in 2012. I am very sorry I haven't. I met my wife, got married, had a child, other things get in the way, and I've written some other books since then. But I've been researching it, and I've been going off at lots of tangents, as you can probably tell, within the story. And after being invited to attend and give a paper at the Shipwreck Project conference, well, the Society of Historical Articles conference in January as part of the Shipwreck Project, that's reinvigorated me trying to get finished. So it's now almost finished. I've now got to find a publisher. And the one thought that I always was, it's an interesting story. It needs to be a documentary. We have documentary makers. The project finished in 2008. There's been nothing. It is my understanding they were approached by the Enslaved TV program with, I've forgotten the actor's name now, if they could include Trouvadore, and they were told not to. So even though there's a chance to promote it, that there's no promotion going on. So that's part of the problem. The other thing that really annoys me is when I was at the conference in Portugal, they're all talking about this ship in Mozambique. It is the earliest found shipwreck of a slave ship that sank carrying enslaved Africans. And it was discovered in 2013, 5 years after the Troubadour was found. That is now on the records as saying this wreck in Africa is the oldest records, the first find ever of a ship that sank carrying enslaved Africans. Now, we've lost that title, and that's something I want to see gain back. And I want to see more of the project, the Trouvadore Project, being involved in the Slave Wreck Project. If none of you have heard of the Slave Wreck Project, it's a fascinating project. It's being funded and financed by the Smithsonian and several other universities. But their goal is to train Black archaeologists in Africa, in the Caribbean, and in the Americas, the skills, both land archaeology, but more importantly, maritime archaeology, to actually go and excavate shipwrecks that relate to Black heritage. To train people up to do that, not only to do the excavation works, but to protect those sites and to promote those sites. They have a program of taking young people in various countries, especially in Africa, and training them. They're not archaeologists, they're not scuba divers. They take people who've got enthusiasm and train them the skills they need to be the field workers and the protectors of the future. That is no longer white people with Western educations being told or saying, this is what we're doing and why we're doing it. It is the local community going, we're doing this because it's our heritage, it's our people, it's our ancestors, it's our story. And the whole point behind the Trouvadore Project was to do that. And we were doing that before the Slave Wreck Project. And one of my biggest things for the Trouvadore Project is, believe it or not, the first season we couldn't get funding. We got half our funding in the end from the hotel industry in the Turks and Caicos Islands. And we were asking why did they want that? Why they were going for funding into this? It wasn't sort of thing that was a tourist product. And it's because they said, we have tourists coming here and our staff have no knowledge of their own history. And therefore we'll put money into this. They put $40,000 into it, as long as you come and give presentations to our guests and to our staff. And in 2004, we had one of these sessions, and I watched the staff almost be dragged into the meeting to be given the presentation. And you know, when you have one of those audiences which are not that positive to you, and you're thinking, at the end of that presentation, a young lady stood up, I guess 18, 19, who I didn't think wants to be there, but she then said, thank you. This is the first time anybody's tried teaching me about my history. Because in the schools, the books were Jamaican history, because we were governed at one part of Jamaica, or Bahamian history, or Caribbean history, if there's such a thing. It wasn't about Turks and Caicos Islands history. That's changed slightly since then, because Carlton Mills, the deputy head at the community college, just after I left, I think I provided 5 chapters for him, produced a textbook for the community college on Turks and Caicos Islands history. So they now have a history book of it. But realistically, this project is one where we believe today that every blood-born belonger, the name they give themselves, is related to this story directly. Unfortunately, the island is overdeveloping very quickly. The population when I moved out in 2000 was 21,000. It's now about 50,000. And a lot of the population has increased, but they've increased because of honorific titles being given. So we need to get it back to people saying this is their country, this is their identity, these are the people, and this is what it's about. It's not about tourism, it's not about that. It's about understanding their own heritage, their own culture, their own history. And unfortunately, I don't know if any people, what we found in the Texas designs was they all were looking towards American culture. They were no longer looking towards Africa for cultural links. They were looking at basketball as their sport, cartoons on TV programs that were related to gang crime and so on. They would have their underpants on show so they could see the brands of it because that's what the Americans did. It was a bit worrying that they were complete change this generation away from looking at the culture of their own islands to looking at a perceived better culture in the Americas, in North America. And that's the end of my presentation. So any questions?
Wow, that was just fantastic. Oh gosh, what an amazing experience to have spent that time out there and to be able to have that. Now I'm going to ask Jonathan, have you got time to ask any questions, Jonathan? Because I know Jonathan wants a link with you, Nigel. I'm not sure if Jonathan's left his...
Hi, Liz.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, no, I would love to be in contact with Dr. Sadler. I mean, there's so many points of contact. I mean, we obviously have the sunken city of Port Royal, which was a major part of the early settlement, English settlement. And there are a couple of ships were on it. I don't think they still exist, but after the earthquake, some of the ships came back in on the sort of filling the vacuum and covered over some of the buildings. And so, you know, we have quite a lot of, and similarly, there was always an avoidance of that history in Port Royal. I mean, you would speak to royalists and they would say, oh, we had nothing to do with slavery and we're not part of that plantation business. But, you know, the whole city was kind of founded on pretty much on slavery. I mean, as well as piracy and sugar. But it was a sort of, and then I inherited a little museum out there. And it was remarkable in that there was only 2 mentions of slavery in the museum, one on the abolition and the second one on the squadron which enforced the abolition. So that was kind of the sole amount. So a couple of very similar issues. I mean, I guess Caribbean issues there. And yeah, so fascinating talk, and thank you very much. I'm sorry I do have to leave, though. I got ton of things coming in.
So Liz, you can just send me my email if you want.
Yes, of course I will.
I'm going to come up on that one as well before you go. I'm also involved with a project called Museum of Diversity, being led by a guy called Troy. Hopefully he'll give you, I've given Liz his details, he'll give you a talk. His aim is trying to set up a museum in Britain on Black history, on the Black Lives, but they seem to have diverted off a little bit at the moment, and they're now covering a lot of projects in America and the Caribbean. He's Jamaican himself, and Port Royal is one of the subjects there, and he's working with some community college in Jamaica. And the idea is, again, trying to encourage people to learn about their own heritage, their own culture, but also to train people into protecting it. So looking at how can we get the future archivists, the future museum professionals, even the future teachers who will teach local history. Even in Jamaica, you don't necessarily have to teach Jamaican history, you can teach your town's history, which is different to another part of Jamaica, or you can teach a family's history, which is different to another family in that country. And I think that's quite significant when you get down to the local level, and they're trying to do that at schools in Britain. We do the Great Fire of London. I went to our school recently, the local school where my son's at, and said, Great Fire of London, 1866, great. 1666, great. What about the Great Fire of our town, 1866, where most of our town burnt down? Are you going to teach that to the kids? So we now teach that as well as part of it. It's just saying, try and get the local education, the local schools to feel that it isn't just a national thing that goes on. We have local things which are significant to us that may not be significant to anybody else, but they're significant to us because it's how it shaped our town, our population in our town.
fascinating. I want to talk to you about that in a moment, but Garrick's been hanging on to have a word with you. Thank you, Jonathan. And,
very informative presentation, Jonathan. We haven't had such a presentation beneath the water, as it were. We've had lots of presentation above, but not beneath the water. Couple of things. You mentioned funding and the difficulty in identifying or being funded. I'm just wondering, now that the global reparation conversation have started, whether or not, you know, that could be a means of accessing some funding. And also in relation to young people, you know, being trained, you know, that should be quite appealing, you know, in terms of the global work, and in particular Pan-Africanism as a wider subject matter. And then the third point about making a documentary, I'm wondering if Steve McQueen might be interested in, you know, in the documentary, if a script is out there.
The problem is territorial. And I'm aware we're being recorded, so be careful what I say. As soon as you're a group of archaeologists take responsibility for the archaeology, they don't like anybody else getting involved in it. As soon as you've got a documentary maker involved in something, they don't like getting involved in it. Anybody else getting involved. The truth is, when a museum gets involved in something, we go after partners. We want other people to get involved in it. And so even though I was the person responsible for getting the license and doing a lot of the initial research work and getting the story out there, the project became one of funding and what we would do with the information. And quite a lot of time, my goal was to get the information out into the Turks and Caicos community, which goes against what archaeologists are trained to do, which is you hold on to information, you keep it, you keep it, you keep it until you have a complete story to tell. And I'm going, we've got a bit of a story, tell it now. And if we hadn't done that, we would not have got the hotel sponsoring us. But they are very adamant. So when I left in 2007, I wasn't part of the 2008 season. They announced in American media that the ship had been found and named now. That's fine. There's no site report for 2008. I can't get a site report for 2008. So I'm writing a book. I know what was found, but I can't find anything official. And even the diary pages on the website that was live, they've all gone down now as well. So if you're trying to do research work on the project was found, it sort of just ends in 2006 with stuff I published. And the reason why I was invited to the Shipwreck Project talk in Portugal earlier this year was not because I'm the archaeologist, it's because I've written 2 academic papers on it, which are out there, but I've also written a lot of non-academic stuff on it. But it was the academic papers they picked and said, you've written all this, can you come and give a talk on the shipwreck? The archaeologists who are on the project have never written an academic paper on it, have never published anything. And in fact, the 3rd season, they actually stopped the project after saying, yeah, we got the wreck, to look for 2 American anti-slave ships. So the American ships, because it's easy getting funding from America, looking for American ships. And so I agree with you, they've got this thing, but it's actually that mindset. It's getting over that first hurdle. If you've got somebody in your island which is passionate and is, in the sense it was a Turks and Caicos Islands passionate about it, you could probably go a lot faster if it wasn't, if it's their country. When you've got Americans or other Europeans or other people involved in it, it becomes problematic. And I give talks on this. It's not my story. I'm trying to get that across to people. I'm telling a story on behalf of other people because no one else is telling it. And I've talked to David Bowen recently, and he's adamant he wants that story told. It's his family story, but he doesn't know who in this country can tell that story. I've been in contact with other people in the Turks and Caicos Islands saying, how do we get Turks and Caicos Islanders telling this story? Not me writing a book going, here's a book, and people going, you're just doing this for money. There's nothing, I won't get any money for writing a book, I'll be honest, on this, because it's not going to be profitable. But it's getting the information out there. And that's my problem sometimes. It's information is blocked. And if information is blocked and there's narrow hole being held by 1 or 2 people who don't want information out there, it becomes real problematic because you think, I get put off, I'm going to, should I carry on doing this? Because if I get around the corner and somebody's blocking me and I can't get the information, how do I get that information?
Right, fascinating, fascinating. Has anybody else got a point, or can I come in with a couple of things I wanted to know? Very specifically, Nigel, you mentioned the 177 survivors that were picked up by local people. So what's that story about?
No, that's a slave ship. That's the slave ship wrecked, and the crew got the Africans on board onto the beach. And then on the beach, 15 of them ran away and escaped the bush. One, in the process of running away, was shot dead. And the 177 were held hostage on the beach by the Spanish crew with guns. When the people from Middle Cape came across, they took the guns off the Spanish people, looked after the 177 on the beach, and the Spanish crew had to go into the bush to find the rest to bring them back. And the one thing in the story that gets me is there's no criminality. There's no prosecutions. Everybody's trying to pass the buck, because why wasn't the man who shot the woman prosecuted for murder? They went to Nassau, where they should have been tried. And very clearly, there's no court case. They would have been sent back to Cuba very quickly. So even though every level of criminality is there, there's no prosecution. And again, because there's no prosecution, there's no court records. Because there's no court records, we don't get some of the information we need to tell the story. But that 177 were part of that 193 who survived the wrecking. Oh,
right. Okay, I understand that.
And the person who went to rescue them, I've forgotten the guy's name now, was also involved rescuing the people from the Esperanza as well. So there were two people from Middle Cape who were involved in both stories, because they were both the major rescuers of the Africans.
Oh, gosh. And now I just wondered, I'm fascinated by the salt harvesting. And thanks, Unita, you have to go on, but you're saying many thanks too, and everybody's giving you some really good positive feedback in their comments as they leave. So I'm interested in salt harvesting. My family in Cheshire were actually involved in salt mining, but here we've got an example where the salt was produced in the Turks and Caicos.
Yeah, the salt that's produced in Britain is from wells, and generally you bring it up and you then boil it, and it's an artificial process. In the Caribbean, it's by solar evaporation. And so Grand Turk is a very low island, and part of the center of the island is actually below sea level. And there was a great story of a hurricane hit the island, hit the area. This was before my time, so in the 1990s, and a plane flew over Grand Turk. Said, "Oh no, Grand Turk is devastated. It's all flooded." Grand Turk is an island which is 10 square miles, so 7 miles by about 1.5 miles. It has a big creek at the north end, a big creek at the south end, and in between the two are the salt ponds. So the center of the island is water always, so it's not flooded. So when they flew over, they just saw what it looked like normally. And initially, the water would just wash in, be held there. The sun would evaporate the water, and it would leave the salt around the edges. You pile it and take it away naturally. What they then did was build canals from the sea into the ponds, and you then have different ponds. So the first one was where the water would go into and would be held until the water went pink. For the same reason why flamingos are pink, because they've got brine shrimp in it. The flamingos eat the brine shrimp to get the pink color. The water goes pink. At that point, you go move the water onto another area using initially human labor, but when the enslavement ended, they used windmills, and it goes into another pond where it's raked into piles, and the water evaporates out, and then the piles are actually bagged up and moved away. And we're talking one bit of rain can undo a whole harvest. If you have a storm coming in and it actually puts fresh water back into the salt ponds, it can ruin the country. It can ruin the country for 2 or 3 years because they don't have the money to reinvest in that season. So that did happen. If you have a big storm that comes in and washes it through the canal system, because the paddles on the canals fail, again, you're putting salt water back in. When the water is returned back to the sea, it's about 3%, I think, salt in the sea water. When it's returned back, there's even a quite high salinity in the water going back because most of the water has been evaporated out of it. And you've got it on Grand Turks, okay, but the salt owners, with the salt proprietors, were the wealthy people in the islands.
Yes, that again, fits in. And here in Australia, we have these pink lakes. I flew to Mildura a few years ago, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing out of the plane windows, because I'd never heard of pink lakes before, but they are.
But again, if you read Mary Prince's account of her life as an enslaved woman, there's about 10 years of that in Grand Turk as a salt worker, and that she then blames that on her later illnesses and blindness.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so that's fascinating. Now, and thank you so much. But I'm just going to say to folks, this little slimish book, The Legacy of Slavery in Britain, I pounced upon in the International Slavery Museum, because, like you, I feel very strongly that local history is so important, and that communities need to understand their local history. So with that book, which was written before the George Floyd's murder and Black Lives Matter and the extra focus on Black history, but it certainly is very interesting. And when I was just explaining to Jonathan and others earlier about this project that we're hoping to do, the project is about your local history. And in Wales, where Penrhyn Castle is, that area around there, the valley, the Ogwen Valley, they tell the stories there of the strike that the quarrymen went on against Lord Penrhyn, but they don't tell the stories about the plantations. Now, I'm just concerned that this one plantation, which happens to be called Pennants, which is why we went there, we've now got this Pennants Heritage Research Group going, but they only meet when we're discussing things, and I'm not sure how we'll go about approaching the communities where the other plantations were. The Denby one's okay, because that's now the site of the Denby show, and I've been there and I've talked to the site manager, and they're really interesting that we research their history. But I'm hoping as well, working with Jonathan, they're very keen to have a small heritage centre there, and we discovered that there'd been local research, and June's found possibly the person who actually recorded the information way back in the day in Pennants. We're not sure, but we also know Professor Anthony Bogues, and he knew the story at the time. And the story is that there was a campaign, a strike against Lord Pennant by the tenants in Pennants. So we've got two strike stories going on. So I think it'll be very interesting. And I just hope in Kew Pits and Thomas River, which is quite near to Pennants, and some of the pens, Bullard's Pen, if we can engage with people in those communities to help them understand that their own history, and also to talk to people with the surname Pennants in the UK. There's a lot of Pennants, to help them to understand. And we've got the National Trust quite enthusiastic. But you made another point, and I won't go on too much, I'll get you respond. And that is that you talked about the websites going down and the information lost. Now, we've learned by that experience, because we did a project on the roots and development of Rastafari in the West Midlands with my Rasta colleagues. And we actually lost the website. We didn't intend to lose it, but we managed to lose it. So what we're thinking this time, if we create a course that is held by a university, then it will be, or an organisation like Future Learn. But these stories have to be archived somewhere. because all this local research is going on. Now, June Elizabeth Whitesmith Gully is an excellent example of this. In Northampton, the work that she has done and others are just absolutely amazing in the local history. So I'd never heard about Northampton doing anything for local history, though, and let alone the stories of the local Black history. So so I've raised the issue with the National Archives, and they put us on to somebody who spoke to us, who's doing a PhD and study into how we could have a national archive. But then the same applies in all the Caribbean islands and
at the moment, at the moment, the National Archive does a good job in collecting the official documents. British Library does a good job collecting all the stuff that's published in Britain. But you've got to think also, and the name is completely over the head, there is in London the Black Archives.
That's the Black Archives, yeah.
And the Black Archives has done a really good job of collecting material. There is also, unfortunately, the British Empire Commonwealth Museum had a really good collection, but that's now with Bristol, I believe, because Beckham closed. So there are archives out there with a lot of material, but people just don't know they're there or don't know how to access it. And so when we talk about the British Archives, we go, oh, the National Archives at Kew, British Library. The truth is, a lot of the large estates, whether they're owned by National Trust, English Heritage, or privately, have their own archives. And sometimes it's trying to get their archives online. A lot of museums do temporary exhibitions. They're up for 6 months, especially during Black History Month. They're up for a month, and then that research is put away in a drawer and forgotten about. So there must be some way of actually saying, how do we get this information out there? How do we preserve it? So it isn't just a month-long project. And that's one of my concerns with Black History Month in Britain. It's a get-out clause. It allows a lot of organisations to go, for a month, we're going to do this. And they do a quick project research, and then on to the next community, then on to the next community. It's not building partnerships with communities. It's not building partnerships with collections. It's not building a relationship with the museum. One of the reasons I left a local authority museum, and I won't say which one, was every Black History Month I was told, here's your budget, do an exhibition. I said, can I have 5 years budget now in one go, and I'll reinterpret the whole museum? So it becomes inclusive, and it's inclusive about Asian history, African and Caribbean history, Asian Caribbean history, childhood, disability, women's history, I mean, everything. You'll have a museum that's inclusive. It's not just stayed in the Victorian style. It's not because we've got new archives, we've got new information since we did the galleries 20, 30 years earlier. They were desperate to have a political agenda, which was Black History Month. And that's part of my problem is, if you've got a political agenda to do something for the sake of doing it, it defeats everything else. So I'm not the only one. I attended a conference back in 2007 in America, which is the ASALA, which is the American Study of African Life and Heritage. It was about 5 white presenters, about 3,000 Black people there. I was the only presenter who stayed on for the whole conference. And I said, do you mind me staying? And they said, of course you can stay. We want you here. And I did day trips with them. It was wonderful. And what they were saying is, they would like to see the end of Black History Month because it's a get-out clause. It allows everybody to go, just for that 1 month, we're going to do this. And then somebody else goes, well, we're going to have Asian History Month, then we're going to have this month, we're going to have that month, because everybody's feeling disillusioned with how society tells their story. But museums, archives, like, should be inclusive. And that's the good history, the negative history, the indifferent history sometimes, but it should be inclusive. And unfortunately, politics gets in the way of everything.
Well, thank you for that, because it kind of reinforces my way of thinking. Garrick, over to you.
Yes, absolutely right, Nigel. I concur with what you said. There is this thought at the moment, we are pushing Black History 365. So it's not just 1 month. We tend to kickstart October and then continue right through 365 days. So we will continue to do that. I have 2 copies of your book. This one, which is the slavery. And I was fascinated by the British peers because I live in New Brighton, you see. So in your book, the tower, New Brighton Tower, before Blackpool, that was the place to be. Very fascinated. And I was wondering how you jump from, talking about slavery into Brit Peers, etc. But that's
an easy answer. I returned to the UK in 2007 to be part of a couple of projects for the bicentennial of the end of the slave trade. And so I worked on a couple of big projects in England. I set my own company up, did other projects, did research work. At the end of 2007, I contacted Shire and said, I've been on your list of books and I can't see one on slavery. Where can I find it? And they got and said, we've not done one. About a week later, the editorial department came to me and said, you contacted us about a book. Why? I said, because I've thought the way you produce books, the slave would be a perfect one for this year, because we need to have an abridged history that's make a pick up, read on a tube, etc. And it's an easy read. And they said, would you like to write it for us? And I went, hang on. I've come to you to get a book and you want me to write it for you. So I then said, yeah, I'll write it for them. And I've now got a Shire book. I've lots of Shires on my shelf on all sorts of aspects of history because they're easy to digest.
Yes.
It's a simple way of going into books and subject matter. And I'm going to say something now, it's going to be really bad. I went to the Caribbean in 2000 to take over the role as director of a museum. I see myself as a well-educated person. I've gone through a grammar school. I've got a privileged white man, all that stuff. I know a lot about a lot of history. I was horrified about how little I knew about enslavement and the transatlantic slave trade. I had a few figures in my head and I went there and I think, and it wasn't until that project I worked on, I suddenly went, I'm so ignorant. And if I'm a person interested in history and I'm this ignorant about the subject matter, God help everybody else who's not reading.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the Shire book was that gap into it. I then was approached. I wrote a book in London in 1997 about the local town I was working, the museum I was running with their very big archive. They came back to me in 2010 and said, 2011 and said, we're redoing the book. Do you want to rewrite it? And I said, yes, but go into the museum and get them to do it because it's their job. It's their archive. They came back to me a couple of weeks later, said, where are you living now? And I said, and they said, we'd like to write a book on that town for us. So I did that. And that's where the peer book comes from. Because he said, right, have you got any ideas for books? And from those books, I got themes. And the British peer, I don't know if you've seen the one peer picture in there, because I had to use a word which is on the peer. A blood relative, not a blood relative, a person I did, was an end of peer showman. And in his books, which I've got somewhere, written in the 50s and 60s, what made him go to the theatre was seeing the men under a pier blacking up to go on stage. And if you look at the book of peers, one of the peers actually has on the pier entrance, tonight's show, the Coon Show. And I've actually highlighted and said, that is inappropriate today, but that was what it was at the time. Yeah. And I'd actually got that postcard of a peer because of my work on inequality and slavery and the language and so on that was used. I'd actually got that from that. And so it went into the peer book, but I said, I can't put into the peer book and not raise that point because that's significant. I've done a book on First World War through postcards. I hate to say it, if you see my thing, I've done a book on erotic postcards as well. So that's naked women, I'm sorry to say. But I got permission from my wife to write that book. I said, do you mind if I write that book? But I've done academic papers on slavery. I wrote a book on the Hannibal slave ship, an article on the Hannibal slave ship for Barbados, which was actually an account of a journey across, written at the time, contemporary time, written at the time by the crew, about the journey of the Hannibal across and how they treated the enslaved Africans on board. Yeah,
I noticed in your opening remarks you referred to Scottish cloth in your book, and also we've had conversation about Welsh cloth, over a period of time. Did you come across any other cloth in your research?
No, because all my research work, and again, this is the bias of research. You go to an archive and you say, well, this book, this book, this book, this book. They bring it out and you read something and you go, oh, and you think of a diversion. And the Scottish thing was that diversion into a prosecution attempt in Scotland. And that's how I know. I didn't find anything else, but it was the Scottish and the Cuban link. I couldn't find the Welsh, or I couldn't even find an English link. It was all Scottish. And it was Scottish cloth, but a bit of metalwork and so on. I did try and see if there's any link with Birmingham with the metalworks, and I couldn't find any link with, because I'm from Birmingham originally. I thought, can I find a link into this story as well? So that, and I couldn't.
Right.
But it was a Scottish cloth, and I know the Scottish Museum, what they're called now, have just done a massive project about reinterpreting their collections, reinterpreting their history and so on. So I supplied them with that information, and they weren't aware of some of that information either. They were participating in the illegal slave trade afterwards by sending material across to be traded to Africa. So it was going to Cuba. That was the official legal trade, but it was almost going straight from that ship onto another ship to go back to Africa to be sold to be traded for the Africans.
Thank you.
The history of cloth is fascinating, and because we had Heritage Lottery funding to do this project to investigate the local history of Welsh Plains, this cloth that was produced as a slave cloth, and went out first of all through Shrewsbury and then through Liverpool, possibly also through Barmouth. But today I've got this from the library here. I'm so thrilled. I don't use the library here enough. And they've got me this book. It's absolutely fantastic. The Golden Thread, How Fabric Changed History by Cassius and Clare. I don't know if you've seen it, Nigel?
I haven't.
No. Well, it's got a whole chapter on clothing for the enslaved people, and it's absolutely fascinating. And in it refers to Welsh Plains, which is why I heard from somebody that they'd seen it in the book. And but there's a lot more in it, because the Scottish cloth was possibly Osnaburg, which they used to make in Scotland. But the clearances in Scotland, the reason that I'm told is that the landowners wanted to have more sheep. Well, either they liked lamb a lot, or they wanted the wool. Now, I can't find out what the Scots did with all this wool, extra wool that they were desperate to produce. So that's a research question for me. I like research questions.
If it's on wet land, it's coarse wool, and coarse wool is not necessarily good for cloth. It's good for carpets. And for example, where we are in Axminster, where Axminster Heritage Centre is, they have sheep, not very many of them, and everybody assumed that sheep wool made the Axminster carpet. It doesn't. That sheep's wool is such good quality, it used to be exported to the European markets. All the sheep's wool that was used for the carpets was purchased from Exeter markets because they wanted the rougher coarse work of wool from the Exmoor and Dartmoor sheep. So it's possible it wouldn't be clothing, it might have gone into carpets. So if you're talking the Georgian times, that's really when the carpet industry was taking off. Axminster carpet started 1755. You've got the carpet factory at Kidderminster. You've got the carpet factories at the other one. I've got too much knowledge in my head. The other place at Wilton. So they had those, and they were demanding a lot of wool. So even in town I live, Ottery, St Mary, the wool factory here that was built here in 1789, it was built to generate wool for not the local carpet factory, for Kidderminster wool. So they were actually selling the wool from here to Kidderminster.
Interesting. I went to the Kidderminster Carpet Museum when I was back home this last summer. And as somebody who did I say earlier, I went to school in Kidderminster. The Parthenon, and we were talking earlier about that before we started the program, weren't we? Anyway, so right, I come from Kidderminster, and I used to be a carpet picker in my holidays. So I know a lot of. So when Rebecca popped up with Axminster, I thought, how does this fit in with it all? But I think one of the things that we're recognizing is that it is the particular quality of wool from sheep that were bred and kept in hilly and mountainous areas. But what's interesting with Welsh Plains is that this wool is used for cloth as opposed to carpet, and that this cloth was extremely hard wearing, and it must have been awful to wear, awful and itchy. So I'm really interested to find out more and understand more about that. But I think in Kidderminster, the trade, and we're looking to do a research project about the transporting of cloth on what is now the A5. It wasn't the A5 in those days, but going from Llangollen, Corwin, Oswestry, and then onto Kidderminster, basically. I was trying to ask the people in the Kidderminster Carpet Museum, which is absolutely fabulous, what they knew about it, but they didn't seem to be thinking back that far. What they're trying to do is to capture those heady days of when I was a student, where there were so many looms in the town and so many factories, and we just used to be there as colour finders.
So one of the things I'm going to say is that one of my subjects is legacy of slavery, and look at how we find that legacy, and carpets are one of them. In that, if you look at when the carpet industry really starts to boom, it's the Georgian era. And why was it booming? Is because you had suddenly these new wealthy people building new houses with major architects building them, and they needed carpets. And so even though the carpets themselves were not made by enslaved workers, didn't go out to the Caribbean, the money buying them was from money generated through the economy of enslavement. And so when you see these big houses, the National Trust Penryn's got an Axminster carpet, for example, we know that, and that was purchased at the time of enslavement. If you look at all the National Trust properties, a lot of them have Axminster or Kidderminster carpets. The royal family have Axminster carpets. The money that was coming to buy those carpets in the Georgian times was coming almost solely from plantation money. If it was new money, if it's old money, it was coming out of all sorts of other dodgy deals. But new money was actually coming out of slavery. And the classic example is that even the guy who owned, what his name now, the Merchant House in Bristol, which is now a museum, he directly bought carpets from Thomas Whitty in Axminster. And that money was actually from his plantation in, I think, St. Kitts.
That's really interesting as a point in its own right. Well, I think we could be talking all afternoon in your case, or in my case.
All night in your case.
So, and all morning. I think our Jamaican colleagues have all disappeared now, because both of them are working. So, yeah. Absolutely fantastic to meet you, Nigel, and I do hope that you'll be somebody who we can link up with again, from my point of view personally, because you've got so many threads and strands that I feel I've got an interest in. And what we were talking about earlier was that on the Australian news, there was a story about Rishi Sunak not meeting the Greek Prime Minister because he'd made, like, put in a what do you call it, clause, so that he wasn't to talk about the Elgin marbles. Well, how can you ever have anybody from Greece not talk about the Elgin marbles? And I was saying that in Kidderminster at the girls' high school, we had a replica of I have to say it was horses mainly. It wasn't men's personal parts, so it would have been more interesting in the girls' high school, but then it was horses. And so I feel as if I've got a sort of closeness to that, and it was good to have had that discussion earlier as well, because there are so many things happening now, and I'm really proud of the colleagues who've worked with me over these 121 sessions, and who we've got a massive mailing list, and folks listen to the or watch the recordings. But this was a really, really special session, and I thank you so much. Now, June Elizabeth would like to say something next. So, Over to you, June
Good
Elizabeth.
evening, good morning, wherever we are, and good night, Liz. I just want to say a special thank you and echo what you've said to Nigel. It was very fantastic and very informative, and I know I can use a little bit of that in my work that I'm doing at the moment. You know, my homework for my MA. So thank you very much, Nigel. And thank you, Liz, for getting this gentleman on the platform. Okay.
Yes.
I don't know if you got my email about the lady for next week.
Yes, I haven't been in touch with her yet, but
okay then. Well, thank you again, Nigel, and I look forward to catching up on the next edition of your book. I will be getting your books.
All right. I was going before you go. I was going to share my screen, and because I didn't do the rest of the PowerPoint that I'd prepared. So this is a list of all the books that you were talking about, Nigel. So if you look up on the Sands of Time Consultancy.com, you can find all these different publications, including the erotic postcards of the early 20th century. and Otterly St Mary Through Time, and that the first book that you did about the slave trade. So if anybody wants a copy of that list, but you can look it up yourselves on Nigel's excellent website, very interesting website. And I'm just going to check the chat. So Rebecca, I was going to say it would be really lovely to have you join us again. Well, I was saying it was lovely that you were able to join us, and I'm really pleased that you want to be on the mailing list. So that's great.
That's great. Thanks,
yeah, and it would be interesting, Rebecca, if you wanted to think about something that you'd particularly like to present on. We sometimes we specifically ask people to talk about something specific, but sometimes, like this time, we negotiate, and it's whatever somebody wants the opportunity to focus on a particular subject, and Nigel chose the Troubadour, and that was so interesting. So if there's anything, Rebecca, that you'd like to share with us about carpets, perhaps, or ships, because you know they're all so integral. Such a big story in history.
That would be lovely. Thank you. Thanks. I'll put some thought into it. Thanks, Liz.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. And Joan, it's lovely that you joined us again today. I was delighted that you could be with us, and I'm sure.
Thanks, Liz. I will in the new year. I shall pitch. I want to do something on basically reactions to newcomers.
Yeah.
So thinking about the Notting Hill riots of '58 is essentially about reactions to newcomers, and it's not. And as you know, it was happening elsewhere in London, but you know that's one. You know that's the sort of the big one, as it were. And I think it's got contemporary resonances. I mean, how do people react when new people come in that they haven't seen before? I think it can be talked about. I don't know. I wouldn't mind just doing something on that to see what other people think. I mean, I just think people shouldn't be demonized just because they're frightened or angry or hostile or whatever. I mean, I think that we need to look at the wider context apart from anything else. Anyway, so I'll pitch that in the new year. If that's okay.
That's a brilliant idea, Joan. Thank you very much. I'm aware, as you heard at the beginning of the session, I do the acknowledgement to country here. And I'm very much aware that I am an incomer. I'm a newcomer here. And even though I've been a few years now. And Nigel, I'm sure you know that experience from your time in Turks and Caicos, you know, when you were there. And your point, Nigel, about your ignorance, I resonates with me so much. I say, if it wasn't for my ignorance, I wouldn't be so interested in so many things I need to find out more about. So yes, I'm aware. I mean, today I was in the library just asking a sensible question and picking up this wonderful book, The Golden Thread. and one of the library workers came over to me and asked me where my accent was from, and I'm kind of like trying to get on with everyday life, and it's a bit like, you know, somebody coming up and touching your hair because it's different, and I was quite kind of, well, I didn't mind, and I explained, but it was that thing about newcomers. Very interesting, Joan. Excellent. Okay,
can I make a comment on newcomers? When I lived in the Turks and Caicos Islands, this is how you make people feel very unwelcome. It's language. The locals call themselves belongers, which basically means the rest of us are not belongers. So we don't belong there. So that was, they call themselves belongers. It's their government, it's their national title. They are belongers. But it basically implies everybody else who's in the country who is not a belonger does not belong there. So
a belonger. Belonger.
So it's the language you use. Just by that word, it makes everybody else feel, hang on, should I actually be here? And if you search that, you'll find online, and the number of belongers hasn't really been increasing that much, but the population has. So belongers are now in a very, very small minority. They're about 1/5 of the country's population. When I was there, they're about 50% of the population. Because the population is booming so much, the number of belongers is declining as a percentage. But only belongers are allowed to vote, for example.
Okay.
How interesting.
Mm.
Yes, it's a fascinating subject, Joan, you're talking about there, and we could dive into that, I'm sure. But I think I was just going to check. There's one more thing on my PowerPoint, which I now can't find. Dear, here we are. It was this one, June Elizabeth. The Windrush Northampton works absolutely fantastic, and now this production, Send Me the Pillow, is now online and an excellent website. I don't know if you want to say anything about it, June Elizabeth.
Well, I just would like to say that I had the pleasure of going to that at the Royal and Derngate Theatre in Northampton with you, Liz.
Yes, yes.
And since then, since that production, they have interviewed a few people, well, 3 people that I know of, and that was myself, my husband, and Mr. Robert Henry. All 3 are Jamaicans. He's an educator, and they've put the interviews online. So I only received it last week, and I sent it straight to, this week I sent it to you, Liz.
Yeah, I think
so I haven't even listened to my interview. I haven't had time.
Yeah. The link there.
But it's been set out quite easy access, you know.
Yeah.
And why you've got the Northampton Windrush Generation sign there is because of the support that we've given the Royal and Derngate Theatre, you know. And they've asked me to sit on their People's Panel, which I do now.
Excellent. Yeah. You do so much, June Elizabeth. That's absolutely excellent. Okay, I just wanted to make sure that we'd recognise that and the people have got the link. Well, thanks very much, everybody, and I look forward to seeing you again. And next week we have somebody else interesting coming to join us, and June Elizabeth is organising it, so we'll send out the information. Nigel, can I put you on our mailing as well, so you hear about what we're doing? And if you've got anything you want to come and talk to us about, just get on to me and talk. Okay then. So all right. So I've got your email, Rebecca. I think that's the last thing I needed to check. Thanks very much, everybody. Then. So we'll wrap up now and say have a good day.
Thanks. Thanks, Liz. Bye, everyone. Cheers.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. One love. Take care. Yeah. Bye.
Great presentation.